Welcome to Pivoting as a Virtual Leader. Today's session is hosted by the University of San Diego Alumni Association. My name is Kara Marsh Proffitt, and I am the Director of Alumni Operations and Engagement. And I am also a proud alumna of USD's class of 2004. Before I launch into today's session, I want to extend some hopes and prayers from all of your friends at USD that you and your loved ones are safe, healthy, and doing well, despite all of the challenges these past few months have really caused and that all of us have been facing of late. When California stay-at-home orders were given in mid-March, the Alumni Association staff pivoted from in-person to digital engagement. It was a dramatic swing for a very high-touch operation, and today's program is a result of the desire to continue offering meaningful opportunities for our alumni and friends to connect with one another and with the University of San Diego. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items as it pertains to our Zoom connection today. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras off. You will be invited to activate your cameras during the Q&A portion of today's session, which should take place right around 1:20 p.m. Pacific time. During Q&A, you may ask your questions in the chat, and we are planning to wrap up the official program at 1:30, but should there be an abundance of questions for our featured speaker, she has agreed to stay on with us for a few additional minutes. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce today's featured speaker and fellow USD alumna, Pamela Stambaugh. Pamela has practiced as a behavioral change master for over 30 years. She is a seasoned advisor to C-suite executives and senior HR professionals. As president and founder of Accountability Pays, she delivers accountability coaching and leadership effectiveness training to elevate performance on what matters most. For clients, this has included raising operating results, upgrading team performance, and creating a culture of trust and open, authentic communication. She has worked with global, small, and mid-sized companies across many industries. Pamela received her undergraduate degree from Lewis and Clark College and holds an MBA from USD, which she received in 1987. Thank you for joining us today, Pamela.
Thank you, Kara. It's totally a pleasure to be here with you and with all of you.
Yeah, absolutely. As it may not come as a surprise to you, which we've actually talked about, and to the rest of you joining us today, we love highlighting our alumni talent and supporting alumni owned and operated ventures and businesses. So it's very special today to spend some time supporting you and hearing from you after all of your years of experience.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. I have a series of questions for you before we spend some time with Q&A towards the end of the session. And I am going to start with the most important question of all, and that is about really around the topic of people. Let's lay the foundation, I guess, of this conversation by keeping people at the forefront. Can you talk about the importance of people in creating a foundation for successful business relationships?
Well, yes, people are what make the results happen, right? You've heard the old thing, this place would be a great place to work if it weren't for the people, right? That's such a funny, silly thing, and we're really missing the people that we work with now.
Yes.
I can say with regard to leading people that there is no normal right now. We talk about it as the new normal, and there will certainly be practices that have been adopted in the emergency state we're in with the pandemic that we won't go back. So you could say that what we're doing right now is a grand experiment. And if people can embrace that it's a grand experiment and be responsible for measuring what are the impacts of the grand experience, then they can be ready to pivot if what they're doing now isn't working, right? Because nobody's got the right answer here. There is none. There is none. So part of what it takes, especially with people, is to be sensitive that some are more comfortable with change than others. Some are more comfortable with not knowing than others. So you have to watch the signs. You have to ask the questions. You may even be at a place like Randstad, Adecco, and Manpower Group were to collaborate with your competitors. Those are competing staffing firms that aligned to support bringing people back to work when it's appropriate. So nothing is out of the pan, and some of us are into the fire, right? But there is no short-term putting out the fires. It will make no difference to think that you have a ready answer, because it isn't a ready answer. So the question is how, and especially as it revolves around people, not just the decisions about business processes, but how are you seeing yourself being adaptive to the unknown? Do you appreciate the opportunity that can come with this? Or are you still suffering over the loss of what was known? Now, as leaders, we don't get the opportunity to sit and suffer for too long, right? It's time to embrace the what would come out of the mouth here, disequilibrium, and
that's a big word,
right? And keep your hand on the thermostat. So it's the leadership that sets the tone, and the tone needs to be around candor and risk-taking. So that's probably a good way to start, right? So what's missing when you're remote? Well, spontaneity, serendipity, the creation of ideas around the water cooler, and certainly there isn't as much inclusiveness. And there are some benefits that come from working remotely.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that just by virtue of us being together today. This is not necessarily something that we would have embarked upon if not having our hand force. And my goodness, you're right, serendipitous and taking advantage and appreciating the opportunity that it presents, for sure. You know, that concept of people and understanding one another and appreciating one another during this time of so much uncertainty is paramount. And I'm so glad that you addressed it. And that kind of leads me into my next question for you is the topic specifically of communication and how important that is, probably now more than ever. Is that something that you're talking to your clients about? And what advice might you have for our virtual leaders who are listening in?
Yes. Well, so cautioning with regard to people that this isn't linear. Nothing is linear. So you need to keep your peripheral vision active. And in terms of communication, how often do you need to communicate to people? As often as you possibly can. You cannot, in a crisis, over communicate. Now, I know some senior leaders can be camera shy. I recommend that you get them a speech coach because there's no excuse today for not being available to the people who need you when they need you. How do you need to communicate? Well, if you make someone wrong, they're going to stop listening and maybe not tell you they've stopped listening. And remotely, it's harder to tell that they've stopped listening. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned earlier that it's really important that you really encourage candor and some significant risk-taking, but not everybody's comfortable with that. So for you, if you're a leader, how comfortable are you being straight and authentic? Or are you still trying to pretend that all is well or it'll soon be over? Because it won't, right? So authenticity, really being clear. If you're scared, don't pretend you're not. Having courageous conversations is not bluffing your way through. It's being authentic. And then saying, and we're in this together, and here are some things that we're going to do. So, for example, I had heard from Scott Hamilton, who's the Executive Next Practices CEO. He was telling me that there was a company that was serving one slice pizza, and of course they were told they couldn't do that. And so this particular company looked at those pizza ovens and went, well, they can melt plastic. So then they began to make plastic visors. So that is a pivot of the finest kind, right? So CEOs right now are worried about their burn rate. They're worried about retaining good talent. So if you know yourself as someone who's a good worker, just know you're desired, you're wanted, you're needed, you're appreciated, even though perhaps your leader may not be as good at saying that.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, it's and the story of the the pivot for that pizza company is certainly a prime example of adjusting with the times and being flexible.
Yeah.
Without it, for sure. I feel like it's really important to talk about productivity. A lot of folks on the line either managing remote work teams or working as part of a remote work team. Can you talk about how managers and leaders can encourage their teams to maximize productivity in this remote work environment that many of us are finding ourselves in?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that, but let's just start. I have a mentor myself with whom I've worked remotely for 20 years, Dr. Harrison, and he has 4 principles that he uses, and I've just interviewed him, so I'm really fresh with his understanding of how he's done that. You're shifting the environment when you're working remotely, and that's all. It's just a better improvement on management practices. And Dr. Harrison has had 0 turnover in many, many years, and he has 4 principles. I'll share those with you. First is give clarity, right? If you don't tell people clearly what you expect, you won't probably get it, and then you'll be disappointed. Second is establish improvement without making people wrong or placing blame. You can improve communication by asking the question, how can we do that together? All right, so that there's a sense of team being created. And then be truthful and respectful. You're going to get challenged when in a crisis, but working remotely involves a lot of trust, and trust is something that's earned and can be lost in an instant. And then last, seek alignment, right? That's what you need to seek. But very important in that whole process is taking a personal interest in people's lives, be generally interested, really interested. What about their kids, their dogs, their cats? And then ask more questions. How's it going? What's challenging? How do they individually take in information such that it resonates? How do you take in information? So check for understanding, right? And then another concern is always flexibility about people's daily practices. Productivity happens when people get in the flow. I just had a conversation yesterday with someone who said, I need a structure, I need rigor, I know that's what I need, so I put it in for myself, but not everybody does that. Mm. So did moving home put them in a tailspin? Are they in fight, flight, or freeze from being distressed? Because if you're too distressed, then you can't solve problems. You're in an upset. And then another really big deal is, what about learning agility? That's going to become a very important item as we go back into the workplace, wherever you are along the continuum. Learning agility for managers is going to be very important, because this is not a linear path. This is one of those. It goes here, it goes there, and you have to be able to let that be okay and still make good decisions, still try things, still test. Are people letting go of what doesn't work and moving easily toward what would work? Can you run small experiments and see what works and what doesn't without making somebody wrong or yourself wrong?
Yeah, I mean, oh, keep going.
Yeah, I got more.
No.
With regard to the productivity, if someone is at home and they haven't already found their own space, they're probably still struggling, because you need, even if it's a closet or the least used bathroom in the house, you've got to have some time alone to think. Some people are natural at home and others struggle. I just talked to my niece who has 4 children, and they had hoped for a long time that they could figure out how to bring the husband home to work remotely, and now it's happened, and so they've got their fingers crossed that it'll stay, because he can be productive. And then there's the engagement piece. How engaged are people? Now, I just want to give you a reference point for this part of the conversation. Engagement requires empathy, and trust is imperative when you're remote. And without empathy, the likelihood that you, if you're the leader, will be trusted is pretty low. So here's the deal. Over many years, 70% of people have been disengaged. That's the data from Gallup. Year after year after year, it hasn't budged. And the cost of that before COVID-19 was between $450 billion and $550 billion. That's a big problem. So where do you think engagement is now?
Hmm.
Right? So that said, with regard to productivity, I do have a client who said to me recently, gosh, and she's in one of the big defense companies in San Diego, and she said, we just learned that within 2 weeks, we were back to our productivity at the pre-COVID-19 numbers.
Impressive.
So yeah, it's not a default, but but it's possible to have engagement in any environment, whether it's remote or live, and that's the function of management's effectiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned agility and kind of parlayed that with the concept of all of us hopefully going back into our physical offices at some point. Can you build upon that, and let's talk about how are we as leaders preparing our teams to get back into our offices? What recommendations, tips, and tools do you have? Just spending maybe a minute or two on this before we launch into some question and answers.
You bet. Okay, so that's really two questions. So when they come back, if they come back, then you need to be taking their physical temperature. That's a given. What
Yes.
you also need to take is the emotional temperature. Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, said in a recent Fortune magazine dialogue with other CEOs that 36% of their employees reported mental health challenges, and that's probably underreported. So if he's got them, you've got them. And then coming back, we spoke about this a little bit, expect grieving from the people who don't see their friends at the workplace. And then in terms of what you provide, you need, again, the clarity, the clear, specific boundaries. You can expect small, specific concerns like, well, how do I keep my food safe from other people's food, right? Because we're worried about the passing of germs. How do I deal with Sally, who won't wear her mask? You're going to have a spectrum of reactions to COVID when they come back. And the main thing that I would say, if there's a theme, is make sure that you're not adding to the fuel of the fire with polarizing perspectives. Because managing paradox, which is the both and conversation, is making space for everyone's views. And that's really, really important. And just quickly, in terms of resources, do you want me to go there next, Kara, or do you have a different question for me?
Well, it's 1:21, so I do want to allow some time for Q&A at this point in time. And maybe what we can do is follow up with all the participants after the fact with some resources and links, if you wouldn't mind sharing those, because I know you're have a wealth of information in that area.
Happy to do that.
That would be awesome. All right, everyone, a half an hour goes very fast, or the last 20 minutes at least, and we will go ahead and if you are interested in activating your cameras for the question and answer section of today's quick half-hour session with Ms. Stambaugh, now is the time to go ahead and do it. There were a couple questions that were asked in advance, so I can dive into those. Well, those of you who may have questions, Pamela can enter them into the chat now. As I mentioned, feel free to activate your cameras if you'd like. So Pamela, the first question that was asked by Lori Lawrence, I don't know if Lori is with us today, is about giving feedback remotely, especially in areas of improvement with a staff member who doesn't like to be on video. Do you have any tips for handling this type of situation?
Yeah, I think it requires that you ask a lot of very pertinent questions, like, why are you afraid to be on the camera? What is stopping you? What do you think I might see, right? It becomes an inquiry so that someone can become comfortable by peeling away the things that might be in the way of that, right? I mean, it's really getting in the other person's world and doing it through the dialogue, and so that someone can shed whatever they're afraid of or whatever they're resisting or whatever is there, and then get to a place where you could say, hey, you know, it would really be important to me. I'd feel more connected to you if we could see one another. That's what we do in the real world, and we're doing the best we can to provide as much of the sameness of the real world here, and we only have what we have. And so let's optimize that, but not make anybody wrong. I said it before, you make people wrong, they won't listen. They stop listening.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what you said earlier about being genuine and authentic with your colleagues, you know, and those who you supervise. I think that falls in line really nicely with that response. A question from let's see here, Victoria Cabot. How do you rebuild morale when some who have been let go or furloughed might not be coming back to the office?
I don't think there's any way to dance around a reality check, right? It's just the circumstances leave some people out of the game, and to pretend that it's okay or to have anything other than authentic concern allow people the space to grieve the losses that they're going to experience. Don't try to pretend it away. It's the grieving process is the grieving process, and people have to go through it. And if they don't, then it leaves shards, and they're sharp. And so you really have to create this. I had an interview with a senior vice president of a company that's got 70,000 employees worldwide. And he said, I just am going to let go that productivity will be what it was. I'm just going to let people be where they were. It has to be okay to be in your human skin in these times. And not everybody responds to things the same way. That's just what's so. So dealing, I was told one time, powerful people have a powerful relationship with what's so, right? And when we pretend or avoid or try to make it something it's not, that's so visible, especially in these times. You know, people are calling BS on what's BS, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
So,
we're definitely moving towards, you know, some of that, some of those uncomfortable and just genuinely difficult situations, you know, as we move back into the office potentially. And I think some people are already back to their offices and already experiencing that. So I can empathize.
Apple brought manufacturing back. You can't make those computers without being in the manufacturing floor.
That's the truth. Next question that was asked. Actually, we have one that just came in through the chat from Bridget Breitenberg. Let's see.
I think it's more of a statement than
it is a statement.
Okay.
I know Bridget personally, and let me tell you what, she is one of the best around. All right, so we had another question come through the chat. How do you advise dealing with a senior manager who doesn't follow the sort of guidance you've outlined today? Is there a way of managing up, so to speak, to prompt better practices?
Yeah, so here's where the courageous conversations come in, right? Because that's the hardest thing in the world to do, is to call someone out when they have authority over your paycheck, right? That is not comfortable zone. But it's the realm, it's the time when you have to follow your own values and do what you know is right, not what's comfortable. And sometimes doing what's right can put you at risk. But at the end of the day, you'll have self-respect. And when you look in the mirror, you'll be able to do that with a straight face and say, I did what was right, come what may.
Yeah, definitely not an easy situation to be in, that's for sure.
No, and I'll tell you what, I think it's one of the hidden gifts of this situation is that people have to stop pretending things are what they're not, or stop hiding from the realities they don't want to deal with, right? It brings us to a place where we really have to look at what's real and what's not, what's valuable to us and what's not, what can we let go, where do we really want to be if we're not happy at work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I go back. I think there was one more question that was asked previously, so I'll go back to that. But for those of you who are still with us and having any questions of Pamela, please do go ahead and put them in the chat, because we'll have time to go back to those as well. All right, so we have a question that was asked by Renee Fitzgerald, one of my very favorite alumni. She asked how to pivot my business from serving clients in person to servicing them virtually.
Yeah, no, that is a hard one to deal with, because you're used to the face-to-face, and And there's only are so many options available right now. I mean, this is it. You're looking at me, right? This is the reality check here. So I did lose a client. I was working with the San Diego Convention Center Corporation. They've been a client of mine for several years, and they're now housing the homeless. So it's really a hard thing. I had a catering company that I was working with, and they've gone out of business. They just closed the doors and sold the building. And what are you going to do, right? You cannot serve food remotely. So depending on the kind of business that you have, you've either got the opportunity to go remote, or you pivot like the pizza company did and figure out what else to do with the resources and the assets that you have that could be used today. Those are your choices, because it's never going to go back to the normal that we knew. As a matter of fact, I don't know that it's true or not true, but I've been told even the convention center will not be able to hold any kind of convention until 2021. That's devastating. I'm not sure how they'll survive that, if they will, right? It's crazy. And there are some who have essential businesses and are still rolling as usual. We all need our IT, right? We can, all of that. It's not fun. I'm sorry, Renee, I don't have a better answer for you than
that. Two questions that came in through the chat. The 4 principles that you mentioned earlier from your mentor. Could you repeat principle 4?
I think so.
Challenging you to go back to your notes.
I know. Let's see. What was principle number 4? Yeah, so that was Dr. Harrison, who is the creator of the Harrison assessments. And 4 was seek alignment. In other words, and I can harken back to Patrick Lencioni's book on team as well. It's not that you want to have agreement, but once you've had all of the dialogue you need to have, you can at least say, all right, we've talked it all out. We've said everything that there was to be said, nothing withheld, so that everybody feels heard and everybody feels like they're a participant in the decision-making process. And now I'm going to make a decision, and I'm requesting that you align with that decision, right? And it really speaks to, where is your loyalty? You have to have loyalty to the overall company, not to your division, your department, your particular people. Because if you're not all aligning as managers and as leaders with the company, then that leaves a chasm. It creates silos. It's problematic. So the seeking alignment was the principle number 4. The other were give clarity, establish improvement without making people wrong, include them in how you say that. Be truthful and respectful. Working remote involves a lot of trust, and that's given, that's granted and earned.
Yeah. We have another question that came through the chat. This is a tough one, and it's a little bit specific, so I'm anxious to hear your response. How do you manage employer expectations to pursue hosting a major event in June when all other sources are saying it's a bad idea and PR move?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Yeah, I would say that the experts that I've talked to who work in the meeting industry would probably recommend, because I've heard it, that you do both and, right? For those who are comfortable, and the statistics are that 80% of people will not travel. So if you're asking for travel, then you're probably going to have a failure on your hands. But if you can do both and, if you can do the live and the remote and have people have a choice, then you have a shot at it. And especially if it's a local event, not a distance one.
Thank you. Well, unless anyone has any other questions, it looks like we just had one more, the 11th hour. This is for a brand new manager coming into a job now. What strategies, Pamela, would you recommend for building trust among and with a new team remotely? What should that new manager also not do?
Well, yeah, so that's a great question. In fact, I was just having a conversation. The first thing you want to do is establish values. And then if you can make that decision about what should the values be interactive, it doesn't mean that they have to have the final word, but it does mean that they need to say, what do we value around here? What's important to us? Because I just was having this conversation just before this call with somebody who's in the people business as well. And she concurred that if you have alignment around those values, when you think about have you ever, you can let people stick around if they aren't getting the job done because you think you can add to their skill set. You think you can help them get there. But if they cross your values, they're gone, aren't they? Right? It's not like you have a tolerance for people who don't follow your values. So values is a shared set of ways, not just behaviorally, but beliefs. And then if you can look at those values and go far enough to say what are the behaviors that would indicate the values are in place and operational, right? So for example, how you treat people. If you're great to your customers, but you treat your vendors poorly, that's a disgrace to your values.
Absolutely. Well, we are about 5 minutes over our official close time. Are you able to spend maybe a couple more minutes with us because we just had another question come through the chat?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Pamela. This next question, how should leaders handle team members who don't want to return to their physical offices because they love being at home? And take that with this note that this particular firm has already indicated that their productivity is down by 15%.
All right, very good. So some people will be better suited in the office and some will be better suited at home. And it gives me an opportunity actually to say that the Harrison assessment, which is the tool of choice that I use, provides a free look at whether somebody who's a manager is likely to be effective at communication and productivity as a manager working remotely, and same for the workers, the individual contributors working remotely. Might be worth knowing because a hardcore line in the sand about that may not be the best response to what's going on today. Who knows? I don't know whether there's a need for someone at home, right? Whether working at home is actually accommodating a better home situation, as it is the case with my niece who's got 4 children under the age of 7, right?
I identify with your niece.
So you just need to know more about what's driving that situation, and maybe you bend. Maybe you make it possible for somebody to get their workspace the way it works for them. Maybe they got home and found out they're more productive. And yes, I get it, overall productivity can take a hit, but individual by individual, that's the conversation you need to have.
Yeah. Going back to those critical and uncomfortable conversations that you've referenced a couple of different times today already.
Yes, exactly. Courageous conversations are uncomfortable. That's when you know you're having them.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah, and if somebody wants to know about measuring some of this stuff, please reach out to me. I don't know how you can say that, Kara, but I'm available. I've got some free stuff. I got some stuff that might be beyond free, but it might help you. You know, I want to make a difference. So if I can help you, well, let me.
We all really appreciate that. Thank you, Pamela. And since we have a few more minutes of your time and I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat, do you want to talk a little bit more about assessments? I know you've already mentioned Harrison, but what other assessments, tips, and tools might you want to share? And we can certainly, for those of you who are still listening in, send those out via email after the fact.
Sure. So I rely a lot on several publications that stay pretty current, right? It's magazines or it's shorter version. I've been on many webinars, as I'm sure you all have, but it's the Harvard Business Review, and there's a new special one out that just came last night. I went, well, how timely. And it's called How to Lead in a Time of Crisis, right?
Yes.
How handy is that?
Great timing.
I know, right? And we're subscribed. I haven't read the whole thing. I only had last evening. I couldn't get the whole thing done, but I just really appreciate that. And also, Fortune Magazine is pretty darn good about business stuff. In terms of assessments, I have several, but the one that I use as a basis, especially with regard to this new conversation about remote work when it's a new thing, is the Harrison assessment, and it's measuring 175 behavioral preferences and tendencies, and then maps those to the job. Does all kinds of things. Doesn't replace anything you've already got. It might add value. I'm not suggesting you turn on that pivot. I'm just saying if there's if you're challenged in any way and you can see you don't know as much about someone as you should know and you're responsible for them, it might be useful. Might get you to talk. Might get somebody to talk that doesn't want to talk, might get them to turn on the mic. You're right. Like, how do you get people who don't want to change when there's no choice?
Right, absolutely. And I think that goes back to the question that was asked earlier in the chat is, and it's not related to just managing our people who we're responsible for, but how do we then communicate with managers up as well to be more effective?
Yes, it really is a risk, and it's one worth taking, because if you've got a concern, others do as well.
Yeah.
And not like a gang up situation, but like, I want to help you understand something.
Great. All right, Pamela, we are at 1:40 right now. I'd like to be respectful of everyone's time, including yours. Are there any last tips, any words of advice that you want to leave as a parting gift for those of us still with us?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is, work, it gets produced by teams, and teams are made up of people. And so you really need to notice that when we're in this change, where are the problems really showing up? They're showing up in how people are experiencing this change. We're all different. And so a certain amount of respect, a certain amount of consideration, certainly some compassion for people who are they're losing people, they're losing jobs. Some people are just like upside down about, I just had my favorite restaurant across the street say Friday's our last day. Those are real losses. Give some space for that.
Yeah. Very important. All right. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'll go ahead and put Pamela's email up here for those of you who might want to reach out to her directly. We always appreciate the opportunity to highlight alumni business professionals who are doing great things in their communities, in their boardrooms, and their classrooms, and their church halls. If you or anyone you know is interested in participating in a future session like this, please do reach out to me via email. All of you should have it. And until then, please stay safe, be well, take good care of yourselves, and go Toreros.